Oh,
Hello.
hi. Hello.
How we doing?
No, not that great.
The world can be just a disappointing place.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Were you surprised?
Yes, I think in the end I was. That's what I realized is that yeah. I
Yeah.
have an elevated opinion of America than seems to be warranted.
Yeah. Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really shocking. I mean, yeah. Yeah, the only people I know who vote Republican are all demonstrably loony. Things have gone wrong in their lives and it was just destabilizing and, out of control. But it's just, I guess the whole country's feeling that way. Oh, half of it.
Half of it, yeah, apparently.
Hmm. Never thought we'd be here. Yeah,
No, for sure. I expected the boat to be celebrating.
exactly.
And the lady at the store said she hasn't met an American who's been a Trump supporter.
Hmm.
Well, in Seattle, that's not all that surprising.
No, she's in
No, I'm
Norway.
in I'm in Norway.
Oh, that's right. You're in Norway.
The tourist she's
Hi,
looking at.
Joanne.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm just showing you how the theme of the day is windy.
Yeah. It captures the word windy.
Yeah. I didn't know my hair could do that.
Have you seen any auroras?
Yes,
Oh,
yes,
good.
we did. It actually was a guarantee. If we didn't see one, we could come back.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was pretty spectacular too. I'll
Oh,
share it
excellent.
later with the class. Yeah, we
But
have an astronomer on board, and the picture, in fact, my sister took actually shows the Pleiades too. You know, the seven sisters.
mhm.
Very, very, very clear in the picture.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, huh. Okay. 11:31.
Maybe people are too depressed to come to class.
Well, yeah, we've been getting this kind of crowd level. Oh, there you are in person.
Yeah. Oh
All
my
right.
gosh.
Well, let's get started with Helena wanted more on the spiritual freedom. So what
Yes.
it occurred to me that I don't think you all actually listened to the podcast I was signed for you while we didn't have class. So that's actually a good start for it. So I've gone and found the relevant clips in there to show to talk about. So let's see what we can do with that. Okay. So it's queued right up. The host is just asked him, what does you mean by spiritual freedom? Oh, actually, I need to figure out how far we're going on this one. Uh, nine. He talks for a little while. Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it could be helpful if I first say a few words just about what I mean by secular.
Sure.
So, you know, in for me, that's a term that I'm using really in accordance with its etymological roots. So the secular, in my sense, is the worldly, the temporal, the historical. Those are all connotations of the Latin word for secular. So, in my sense, everything that depends on our historical practices is secular. So, like our institutions, our communities, our love relationships. Uh, really any project to which we're committed is secular because it's something that must be upheld by us, and it can fall apart if we don't sustain it. So that's the sense in which something is secular, just because it depends on our historical practices, our worldly practices, our practices that require time and have to be sustained over time. So what I'm calling then secular faith is that practical activity really of sustaining a commitment. And one of the reasons I'm using the term faith is because I really think it's a big mistake to assume that the originary meaning of faith is religious belief. Faith is not primarily faith in something, but it's the practice of sustaining a commitment.
Okay.
And actually, if you think about how we use the term colloquially, how that vocabulary of fidelity, how pervasive it is, like any commitment is something that we have to keep faith with. And that's also why we say that you're unfaithful when you fail to sustain or when you betray a commitment. And those questions of really fidelity and betrayal are really at stake in all forms of commitment. And that's a matter of secular faith, because something that what we're committed to, what we're keeping faith with, doesn't exist independently of us keeping faith with it, of our practice of sustaining it. And that's also why it can fall apart if we fail to sustain it. So in that sense, that's also why in the book I say that, like, in secular faith, the object of faith is altogether dependent on the practice of faith. Whether it's the institution, the community, the personal relationship, it doesn't exist independently of how we are sustaining and devoting ourselves to it.
So the negative sort of religious connotation of faith really has more to do with what religious people have faith in than the idea of faith itself.
Exactly. And that's also why, for me, when calling religious faith, is the idea that there is a special object of faith, like God or eternity or nirvana, something that ultimately doesn't depend on the practice of faith, something that would exist independently and eternally. And that's what you have faith in. And that's also why it's linked to this idea that, like, the finite, the worldly, the historical is not enough. There has to be something beyond it. And that's the idea I want us to let go of. So you could say that, if the highest object of religious faith is something eternal, then the highest object of secular faith is this fragile life that we sustain together.
Something temporal.
And it's really, and part of the movement of the book is to really make a case for why we have a better understanding of the pathos and significance of our commitments from the secular perspective, and why we should let go of this idea that that there is something independent of our practices, so as to fully recognize and evaluate the importance of our life together as the highest good, as it were.
Yeah, and there's something really fundamental in your work, and I've also encountered this elsewhere, but perhaps not quite so thoroughly fleshed out as in what you've written.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that the temporality of our life, this idea of keeping faith with our temporal commitments that are finite and time-bound, is essential to being human.
We tend to think that our spirit
that's
is in our
right.
body.
The commercials,
That's
forgot
actually
about
not
that.
correct. Your body is in your spirit.
Yeah, and essential to anything mattering, anything being at stake in what you do, because, otherwise it would fall apart. And that's part of, like, what animates the commitment to it. So that's part of the dynamic I want to capture in terms of this conception of secular faith.
So then the other side of the...
I actually tried to find just an audio only version of this, so I could try to get away from the commercials, and the time stamps are different. So all my notes about where things were in time didn't work on the audio only version. So we're stuck unfortunately with the commercials. Anyway, what do we want to do here? So, but I think that's a great summary there then of what he's getting at. Welcome. A great summary of what he's getting at with this idea about secular faith. So is this making sense to people? Do you have any questions about this?
I had a question I wanted to ask, and then I couldn't get in here.
Uh-oh.
This is about what we were talking about at the end of the last class.
Oh, okay.
About well, first of all, I had written down freedom is disruptive, and then the part about structural change is necessary and that redistribution and reform or reevaluation. And
Mhm.
I'm just curious if you could say really quickly what you think Hagglund, where he'd say we are right now in this country.
Well,
And I suppose
very,
that's
very, very wide of the mark.
what?
We're very off the mark.
Okay, okay.
No, I mean, I think no, he's definitely presenting a kind of gentle argument for revolutionary change. And I think that's what's interesting about it is that most of the times you encounter someone arguing for that kind of change, they're going to be really kind of strident in how they present it and more dramatic in how they present it. But he's done it in this kind of oddly easygoing way in which he just wants to point out, well, okay, we could go with this reform route, but that just doesn't quite work. So maybe we need to try something else. And then he uses the word revaluation instead of revolution. And so it's definitely a soft version of it, but he's clearly a revolutionary in that he thinks that the society that we need and deserve as human beings to maximize our freedom would require revolutionary changes compared to the way we are now.
Richard, that is so Swedish of him.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, they have this concept lagom. It means not in the extreme. Everything is moderate.
Oh.
And their personalities tend to be that way too. At
So he's
least,
a moderate revolutionary.
yeah, moderate revolutionary. Yeah.
That's excellent. That's great. That's a good one.
Yeah.
I love that. It's part of his culture. It makes sense. He's the way he talks about it's very natural, and he doesn't get too agitated and
Yeah, I'm learning Swedish. And
oh.
my Swedish friend, sometimes I'll say, well, how do you say this or that in Swedish? And she'll say, well, we would never say that. I mean, we don't even have a word for that because we don't do those things. And it usually is around like emotions, extreme emotions.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I for some reason like shows that sort of involve adventures in fishing, with guys fishing for big fish. And there are these poor guys who like to go fly fishing in really unusual locations, and they're in Mongolia, and they're having to get on horses to go where they're going. And when one of the guys says, "How do you say in Mongolian, I have no idea what I'm doing?" And they look around and like, they never say that in Mongolian. So same idea. Just don't have a word for that. We don't do that here. Calm yourself down. We'll give you a better word.
I I do love the way he distinguishes faith in and religious faith, which really requires nothing.
Yeah. This idea
Really,
that the faith is what it requires. Yeah, that's an interesting
right,
term.
right, and that the faith in something requires a sustained commitment. I love that distinction.
Yeah, and his point then, right? It's there isn't a thing that religious people do that is so different from the rest of the world because everyone has to have this to in order to get on with life. That's what you do is
Right.
you have secular faith in all of the things that you do.
Well,
And what are you doing?
his distinction is that there's faith in something else, someone outside of yourself, as opposed to the faith. What did he called it a practice? It's sustaining a commitment to something you care about. So you are the one that keeps it going. It doesn't require God out there.
Right. Well, and I think the especially strong point is just the idea that the thing you have the faith in, if it's secular, it's fragile and needs your faith.
Yes.
Religious, it's eternal and doesn't need your faith.
Yes.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, so then that's a really really interesting way of coming at the question. The logic
Okay.
is there intuitively, but I haven't encountered a lot of people who actually have that particular thought.
Right. Right.
That, yeah, so if it doesn't require my, I mean, this is the thing that comes up in conversations in theology periodically, what is it people are doing in relationship to the divine if the divine doesn't actually need them?
Yeah.
Why does any of this matter? And there are some interesting constructions in which what I've introduced you all with the model called process theology. That the generic of that is called open theology. But so process is anyways one particularly interesting, well articulated version of that thinking. But in that way of thinking, God is not infinite, and so once you take infinity out of the equation, you start to introduce other kinds of possibilities where God can be affected by something. So process has a way of coming at the question a little bit differently, because it's the object is eternal but not infinite. And
Is that a, would you classify that as a conservative idea, liberal idea?
oh no, it's very liberal.
Okay.
Yeah, in liberal religion. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because the religions I know, God requires lots of things.
Well, yeah, mostly.
Well, demands them, but required.
Yeah, he requires.
He demands them, yeah.
But doesn't actually need them.
Adore him while he just sits there and takes it in.
Okay, but I did at some point want to talk actually talk a little bit about this point, what about infinity versus eternal. Because I thought, I mean, Hagglund just kind of glosses over it, so that's why I thought it was worth a little mention. Okay, so infinity is a really difficult concept for the human mind to wrap itself around. And if you've studied any math where that came up, then you probably have some sense of this. But it took the mathematics that I think eventually we're going to call calculus, that gets developed in like the 1500s, for there to be a mathematical expression of the idea of infinity. And from there, people start to use that idea, and it starts to have an important role in theological thought, because that becomes the natural expression for God. If you've talked about God being all powerful, and now you have this mathematical concept, infinity, that is expressing all powerful, something significant changes, and so theological conversations change going into the modern world. But obviously, he's referencing ways in which people thought about the world and lived, in which they had these ideas which were eternal, but they didn't have infinity yet. So eternal seems to me to function much more symbolically. That in that it's because it's hard to grasp this kind of idea that something could never end. We don't quite. I think we people get used to using it without really kind of internalizing what it is they're talking about. So when he comes along with the way he's kind of deconstructing that idea to point out, well, okay, if something never ends, that carries with it the implication that it's invulnerable. You can't kill it if it can never end. So if it's invulnerable, then what is my relationship with that? And that's where he wants us to see that maybe this idea really doesn't make that much sense. Because everything that we know, everything that matters to us is vulnerable, and he's pointing out that's why it matters. That if it wasn't vulnerable, it wouldn't carry that kind of demand on us. It wouldn't matter to us because it would be invulnerable. So it has to be vulnerable. And in a sense, I think it's that might be an easier move. And somehow when you bring it into the language of infinity, it feels a little, what do I want to say? Stickier. It holds ideas more. It holds the concept a little better. It's more compelling in some way. And I think part of that, right? Well, you've gotten a mathematical version of the idea now. So oh, it must be significant because now we have this extra special way of talking about it. So it seems to me in one way he might have actually had an easier time getting people to intuit what he's talking about if he had done it 500 years ago, and that bumping up into a culture that's now comfortable with infinity, it's the argument is much more intellectual rather than emotional. So I think there's a point at which he wants us to appreciate that emotionally, that because it's about mattering. So mattering is going to be someone blowing away leaves outside of me.
Richard, could you say again what he, or maybe he doesn't say what the difference between infinity and eternal is? Is that what you're saying?
No, he doesn't go there. I just thought it was worth pausing for a second to take you there myself.
Yeah, you go there. I want to, what's, keep going. What's the difference?
Yeah, well, that's what it's a curious thing because I think I think it's at one level and it's sticky. That's sort of the best word I'm coming up with so far. But in the same way that because we have a mathematics of infinity, and so if someone wants to talk about God as infinite, that feels like it has some intellectual gravitas because it's working around this infinity concept, and that's complicated math. But at the same time, I think it also, because it is part of this complicated math, it's also more vulnerable in a different kind of way. What I'm sort of getting at is that depending on who you're talking to, someone might have an easier time seeing what he's saying and how it applies to something that's eternal as opposed to how it applies to something that's infinite. That some people, like I have a feeling if you're talking to a mathematician and you're using that language of infinite, they're likely to want to hold on to that a lot firmer. Where if you're talking to someone who's less mathematically sort of inclined in how they see all of it, that word eternal might carry more weight for them. So anyway, the concepts are related, but different in some important ways. And our period in history means we have access to both of them, which, yeah, I think has different effects in different directions. So yeah, I don't have anything especially sort of concrete to say about it other than just to sort of point you in the direction of there's complexity out there in how these words are used and what they mean. Welcome to philosophy. What does it mean? I don't know. What do you think? Yeah.
In my mind, eternal sort of makes my mind go backwards, like, the concept of love has been eternal. And then I would add, since the dawn of time, I'm just making these words up. And infinity sends me to the future.
Forward. That's a really interesting, yes.
At least in my head.
No, I think there's a cultural thing there. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to get at is, yeah, that kind of intuition there. Yeah, that they're working in slightly different ways. I like that. Eternal sends us backwards, infinity sends us forward. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions before we push on?
Wait, Richard, before you go, so before infinity was understood mathematically, it obviously didn't
Understood.
filter down to people. Was God infinite before we understood infinity?
Well, I mean, that's what people defending that idea would say. Yeah, is it just took us time to come up with the idea, but
Oh, I
it was
see.
always
I
true.
see.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, no, it one way this shows up in philosophy is that once you have a language of infinity, you have a different set of arguments that you can deploy if you're trying to prove God. So there's one line of proof that wants to argue that God is a necessary being. And so, but you need this logic of infinity in order to present an argument that has that kind of structure to it. So that's the kind of thing I mean by changed. Once you get those ideas, is that you give the intellectual climate allows for a different set of conversations, and they're going to include some of these really abstract, and really highly technical logical arguments, because infinity is a mathematical concept, is a concept then logic can get a hold of. Yeah, okay. Let's see what else we can get out of this conversation here. And I want to jump
Equation, if it, as it were, is
Mhm.
the spiritual.
Ourselves, what we value and what is worth doing with our time. We have spiritual
something's wrong.
questions and spiritual problems because we can engage that question on what we value and what is worth doing.
Wait a
And
second.
one of the things I'm trying to show is that, I mean, obviously both spiritual and faith are these very overdetermined terms that can seem hopeless from a secular perspective. But just as I think it's a big mistake to assume that faith should be understood in religious terms, I also think it's a big mistake to assume that so-called spiritual questions should be understood in terms of the supernatural, in terms of some kind of contemplation that makes you rest in peace, as it were. For me, on the contrary, like I'm arguing that spiritual questions, and that's really questions about what ultimately matters, what is truly valuable, what we ought to do with our lives. All of those questions, I argue, are like better understood in secular terms. So when I'm calling spiritual freedom, simply put, is our ability to ask ourselves what we value and what is worth doing with our time. We have spiritual questions and spiritual problems because we can engage that question on what we value and what is worth doing. And one of the things I'm trying to show is that only someone who's finite and temporal can lead a spiritual life in the sense, that question of what I value and what I should do, what matters, that can only be at stake because I understand in practice that my time is finite. I mean, if I believed I had an infinite time to live, the urgency and importance of doing something would be unintelligible because there would be no deadline, as it were.
Right.
And that's also why I'm trying to show that like what we usually think of as the highest form of spiritual state, whether Christian eternal life or Buddhist nirvana, that those supposed visions of spirituality and freedom are actually visions of unfreedom, because in that sort of eternal state, there wouldn't be any question what we should do with our lives. There would be nothing to worry about, but for the same reason, there also wouldn't be anything at stake, and there would be no freedom. So I'm trying to show that spiritual questions and spiritual experience, it's not just that it doesn't require something eternal or supernatural. It actually requires something that is like materially fragile and finite.
Yeah.
So it's a way of rethinking these fundamental notions.
That idea.
Okay. So I think it's occurs to me good. I just had a good thought for pinning down his words, the spiritual, as he uses the word spiritual. That spiritual means the capacity to ask what matters. I think that's a good way of, I think, defining the term the way he's using it. Spiritual is the capacity to ask what matters. Now, a lot of, I mean, previous philosophy that's kind of circled around this kind of question, we've called that existentialism. You think about Sartre and Camus, that this idea of asking who am I going, those French existentialists put it more in terms of my, sort of my life. How am I going to define my life? But I think it's exactly the same point. It's just that he's using this other word that's calling out the freedom to ask that question. Where the existentialists, they're coming up sort of this first run of atheist thought, and so the way they have to argue it, I think, takes a radically different form. But he's living 70 years past Sartre, so he can talk to a world that is already informed by some of these philosophical thoughts. So even if he's going to shift the language on us a little bit and want to invoke some of these traditionally religious words like spiritual, but he's clearly talking about exactly the same thing. What is it that's going to matter to me? What I choose is how I define myself. The existentialists would put it more in terms of this definition thing, where he's just focusing on the freedom to choose your definition. But same idea. It's about me being free to choose. And I think I mentioned this before, right? He uses this example with the seagull that comes up because he starts by talking about being at his grandparents' vacation home in northern Sweden in the summer times, or the cats and dogs we live with. That they will make decisions about doing things, but they don't stop and ask, what is it I really value? What is it I want to spend my time on? And so it seems to us that is a uniquely human phenomenon. That's not important to his point. He's perfectly open to dolphins maybe are having this exact same conversation, and we just don't know it because we haven't figured that language yet. But so it's possible there are other creatures that have this kind of freedom, and they're just living their lives in their own ways, and we're not noticing it. But it definitely matters to us that we are the kind of creatures that have this kind of freedom. And I think, and free will came up also, but just to sort of pin that down, it doesn't matter to him, and he doesn't even talk about the question, but I think that signals that it really doesn't matter to him. Whether we are free or aren't free, we experience ourselves as being free in asking those questions. And so whether that's really true or not true is really not the point. The point is we have this sense of it, and that's important. And then the whole project of everything else he talks about is about how are we going to organize the world so that we can maximize everyone being able to act on their own sense of freedom and become self-defining people instead of being just forced around by forces of the economy to do this or that. Okay. How are we doing on all that? Spiritual freedom.
Well, don't you think that it is easier for the democratic socialist in Europe than it is for a capitalist in America to ask that question?
Yes, and that's fundamentally his point. Yeah. Is that the society in which you're living is going to put up all kinds of constraints or open up possibilities, and so that's why it really matters. That we choose to organize ourselves in a way that will maximize our freedom rather than limit our freedom.
Well, we are limited because of the economic system. We are very limited, I think.
Yeah. Oh no. That's the whole second half of the book is him laying out why he thinks that's true and having the material conditions that enable the acting on that sense of that spiritual freedom.
Does that also mean then that our spirit changes? Our spiritual sense changes because of that?
Because our interests can change over time. Yeah. So what's important to us may shift. things can become more important, less important. And for him, that's all good. That's great. It's not that you need to have it's not about commitment to him in a sense of I'm going to do this come what may. It's that I have the freedom to choose to commit, which also means that then you have the freedom to choose to uncommit.
Mm-hmm.
So as the reciprocal of that idea. So and both of those things are free in our experience. And actually, it's interesting, Helena. The way you asked that reminded me of something about the way Camus talks in particular, because Camus starts off. I think it's the myth of Sisyphus with the only important question in philosophy is that of suicide.
Yeah.
And what Camus and I think Sartre and that crowd, what they're wanting to emphasize is such a radical view of freedom that Camus wants to say that no matter what situation you are in, you are fundamentally free because there is this one question that's always open for you to ask. And in that sense, the structure is sort of irrelevant to freedom in that ultimate sense, because you ultimately always have recourse to this final question. That's a bad way of putting it, isn't it? But Hagglund clearly is much more interested in the social human being than the isolated existential human being of existential philosophy. Now, it's interesting that the existentialists are also communists, so that Camus and Sartre both also thought that if for human beings to maximize their freedom, we needed a different context. So they all are agreeing that they need this revolutionary change. But for the people whose lives were always about revolutionary change, so they're more traditional Marxist thinkers, they had a hard time with the existentialists precisely because of this point that Camus wants to come back to this ultimate point of freedom. And so in that sense, Camus is downplaying the degree to which that context is really vitally important, or Hagglund might even say the most important question, that if you're trapped by your situation, then you have no freedom. And so to have it, you need to change the context, change your material conditions. So that he puts the revolutionary change front and center, even while he's talking about this spiritual freedom, where it seemed to a lot of people that the French existentialists were making the revolutionary change, the social question, a really secondary part of what they were doing. Hagglund's clearly married the two of them to say they're equally important and interrelated, and so you can't have one without the other. So there's an interesting difference between what Hagglund's been up to and what Camus and Sartre were up to. But my own personal thought process has always resonated in the direction Hagglund was going. So I always read Camus and Sartre in that, through a kind of Marxist lens, that they're still talking about the change. There's these other things they like to emphasize. But Hagglund, in the way he talks about it, really shows the dramatic difference in those presentations. What is it like for an existentialist to actually fully embrace social change as the necessary project for existential freedom? Well, you end up with a book that does both of them at the same time, and there it is. There's that book. So that's another way in which I'm really impressed with Hagglund and what he's been up to, is that it's such a dramatic re-engagement with those ideas from the French existentialists, but it's such a new reading of it. It feels very different, even though I think I can break it down this way, analytically break it down, that they're really talking about a lot of the same things, but the way he's done it is much more sophisticated compared to the way they were doing it.
Historically, it all kind of, as you're talking, I'm thinking how it sort of comes together for example, in the French Resistance and the Marxists in the French Resistance. They were they knew that they could be killed at any point. They were in a dangerous situation, but they would rather fight. They'd rather die than not live under a Nazi rule.
Mm-hmm.
And how am I getting that right? Is that the two ideas coming together in that way?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, and Sartre was captured. He during the war was captured and was a prisoner of war for a while.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But he wasn't an ordinary soldier. He was part of was a resistance fighter, but still was treated as a prisoner of war. Not quite aware.
Well, they had their cyanide pills. They always had the option.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And in that way, Hagglund seems more optimistic.
Yeah, thank God. Yeah.
So yeah, it also that has that added benefit too, in that yeah, he just seems like this much more optimistic. We're just gonna go and make this change, and you leave behind the conversation about fighting Nazis and cyanide pills. Yeah, it's the feeling of it, very different kind of feeling.
Yeah.
And of course, their contexts are very different. I mean, these guys were writing, so, so they started their writing during the war, during those experiences. So they're important in their lives. Yeah, and he doesn't have that experience. Yeah.
So now we all have to see how we can change Trump.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to work hard. It'll take a lot of work, doing a lot of work.
Helena, did you say change Trump?
Well, we have to change do away with Trump, the thinking of Trump. Let's face it, most Americans now voted for this guy. So what are we going to do?
Yeah, we need to beef the education system.
An article I read, this guy already said we have 792 days till the next election, and we gotta start now. Yeah. I mean, not the presidential one, but the midterm, the midterms. So he's already started. He's already starting to think of what to do.
Yeah. Oh my. Yeah, would that we had a parliamentary system. It'd be so much more rational. But that's a big thing to change, fortunately.
We could also suppose free ourselves from all of it.
Well, this is a part of that wisdom from the existentialists. You're choosing what you're going to engage with, and so choosing then, in some sense, how to define what you're going to engage with. So those are important questions for people to figure out going forward. Okay, let's go back to a little bit more while we have time. And excuse me a second, I need to figure out where to go. His version of why the cat is not free.
Eternity actually gets in the way and sort of short circuits
and that's actually
don't have the ability to decide what to do with it.
Exactly, and engage the question passionately or anxiously, etc., about what to do with it, and that's actually that can be anxiety-producing, paralyzing, but it's also like how we can actually. I mean, you could put it this way. I put it this way in the book that, like, for all living beings, life is valuable in the sense that all living beings are committed to maintaining their lives, but like only spiritually free beings can ask the question of what is valuable and what is worth doing. Part of this strategy, I mean, you rightly asked about the strategy of using these terms like spiritual and faith and so on. I mean, it has to do with the general strategy of the book that, like, instead of thinking about the secular as what we have when we sort of subtract these religious notions, like actually the secular, the time-bound, the finite, if we take that seriously and avow our commitment to that, we'll actually have a better way of accounting for questions that have traditionally seemed to require, something infinite or eternal or transcendent.
There's something really amazing about this turnaround, because I think sometimes maybe we're on Facebook or something and we're feeling like we're having a hard day, and we make these sort of thread for the anxiety, and sometimes we do wish we could be our pet dog, but you're saying like this is actually the most beautiful thing, that we can actually have this anxiety, and not that the anxiety is the point, but that we can be free.
Yeah, absolutely. And the anxiety is also an index that it matters what we do, and that something's at stake in what we do. And like, it's a very delicate argument I'm trying to thread through the book, where I want to acknowledge that like the risk of failure and loss and the risk of wasting your time, etc., is an essential feature of spiritual life. You have to run that risk, to also have a chance of doing something meaningful. But it's very important that one seizes that argument without thinking that way, like, oh, I'm fine with wasting my time. Of course not. It has to be still a negative moment, but it's also productive of these things that are positive and meaningful. So it's...
Hey everyone, we're having our biggest sale ever on our award-winning meat sticks. So today, for a limited time, you can get...
Always throughout the book, try to think like, you can't have the passion without the anxiety. You can't have the joy without the pain. You can't have the chance without the risk. And thinking those together is really the heart of a secular understanding of who we are, in my sense.
Yeah. So,
okay, so that seems I think also an important point in all of this, that if we're free, that means we have open possibilities. We could choose wrong. We could mess it all up. And so with freedom comes this anxiety. And and I love that I think maybe I'm discovering it's just the basic Swedishness of his thinking, and that's okay. That's okay. Life's gonna have a little anxiety too. That's okay. So, but I mean, there's certainly other people who would come at this with a much more sort of dramatic and kind of I don't know what I want to say, forceful kind of presentation that well, even Sartre did, right? He wrote a play called Nausea, that being free for him has this way of causing nausea, because it can be overwhelming. That what am I going to do? This? Am I going to do that? Who am I going to be? This kind of person? Be that kind of person? And Hagglund, he's wonderfully soft selling it, and it does occur to me this is another case in which he's just benefiting from coming after them. That I think when Sartre's coming up writing these ideas, he's one of the first people thinking these really unusual thoughts about what it is to live in a world that doesn't have God in it, and so he encounters that this freedom means then that someone isn't telling me what to do. I have to figure out what to do. So it's on me, and that's going to be difficult for me because I have to do it. But in the intervening decades, existential thought has just sort of gotten comfortable with that yeah, being existentially free is gonna be a source of a little anxiety. And that's just the way it is, and that's okay. It's not gonna end your world that you're struggling a little bit over how to define yourself. And in some stages of life, for the adolescents, it may be perfectly natural that they're experiencing anxiety while they're trying to figure out. And that's all well and good. It's part of the human experience. So yeah, so I really like that way that he's doing that soft sell with this question. Yeah, it's there, it's an issue, but you don't need to go flee off and searching eternity. It's okay. Just live with a little bit of that anxiety, and because things are going to matter anyway. You can't that Turner thing isn't going to work for you anyway, even if you try, because there's too much here in the world that matters to you. You got to engage it somehow. So settle down. Don't worry. Don't be too extreme about it.
And yet we still have this sense that we must be perfect.
Well, that's what he's, yeah. Which I think yeah, that I think is that eternity bumping and
that's
demanding something
what
from us.
that's
Yeah,
what I'm thinking.
yeah. And so if you
I
don't have that, then you may not have that particular form of anxiety.
Right. I mean, it seems like God or believing in God almost instills that notion of perfection
Mm-hmm.
that you
No,
have to
God
be
likes the sinner. That's not really true. God loves the sinner. Look at Trump.
Well,
He loves the sinner.
well, in the
It's
traditional sense, Elena, I know what you mean, but my traditional notion of religion is you have to be this perfect
You have to repent.
human in order to get God's grace.
Yeah, and there's I don't know if we'll get to it. It's in a different interview, but the interviewer asked him about, well, what about constructions of hell? And he kind of just sort of ignores the point, but that specific, but acknowledges along the way that if you have the opposite pole with any of these things, and so if you have this pole that says everything's going to be fine, there is a side of that says, well, everything maybe it's going to be a disaster for a constant and unending disaster in the form of hell. And that both of them share that feature. And so to him, it sort of doesn't matter which way you want to talk about it. More practically, I could point out that constructions of hell have become less and less important the last couple hundred years. And so there's a lot of especially in liberal theology, there's a lot of theologians who would just sort of give up the whole notion that what they would define hell as would be having distance between yourself and the divine in an eternal afterlife, and that any distance that might be imposed would be like hell because you don't have this ultimate bliss. But what they're arguing really is that the neutral state compared to the positive state, as opposed to arguing there must be a negative state that's the contrast to the positive state. Now just the neutral state is the contrast with the positive. So anyway, so you don't hear modern theologians talking about hell, which is my point. At least on the liberal half of theologians.
well, who again said hell is other people?
That was Sartre.
Yeah.
That was in the play No Exit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is an important, a deeply important point in its own way. Is as social as we are, other people still are difficult because we have to negotiate with other people and compromise with other people, and so that's this demand that if we didn't have all the other people around, we just we'd do whatever we want and run around, nobody to hassle us, but we'd also be terminally lonely. So it's. Yeah, you have to have the other people, but that also means you're going to have to negotiate with the other people. It was a dramatic way of putting it, that's for sure. Hell is others. All right. Okay, let me do one more quick thing then, while we have a little time. Share that, figure out where I want to go. Okay, let me try this. 17:05.
As we've said, you make the case that we can only really recognize our lives as a life, and we can only care about whatever we do.
Can live their lives with commitment and passion, but the question
live this life with commitment and passion, as well as having faith in eternity. How do you respond to questions like that? I'm sure you've heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an important question. And to be clear, of course, on my account, people who identify as religious can live their lives with commitment and passion. But the question for me is, and the question I'm trying to raise is how we should understand the deepest source of that commitment and passion, And there's a very widespread sense that without the religious sense of eternity or the transcendent, life would be meaningless. And my argument is on the contrary, that there's a sort of secular sense of finitude at the heart of care and commitment. even for those who identify as religious, so like in practice, this is what I'm trying to show, that like what animates that care is a sense of finitude, secular sense of finitude rather than a religious sense of eternity. So that, in practice, caring about someone or something requires both that you believe in its value, that's the first movement of secular faith, but also that you believe that it's fragile and that it can cease to be. So for example, it's because I recognize you as finite, I can understand that you're in need and it matters how I treat you. And more generally, like it's only in the light of risk and failure that we can be committed to sustaining anything that we value, and that fragility is part of what animates the commitment in practice. So, another way of saying that is there's an important theological distinction that I use for secular ends in the book, and that's the distinction between living and dead faith. That this is a notion that, as I'm sure you know, it goes from the letter of James to Aquinas and Luther and Kierkegaard. Where like the living faith is really the faith on which you're prepared to act. It's a faith that in practice shapes how you're affected by what happens to you. And at its very strongest, that's the faith on which you're ready to stake your life, Whereas the dead faith is something you claim to believe, even though that faith is not manifested by your actions, and even though you wouldn't make your life depend on it. And one way of thinking about my argument is to say that, like, well, to show that like our living faith is secular in my sense, and invite religious people also to recognize that like in practice what actually animates their passion, their commitments is this secular sense of fragility. Even if they might avow a religious faith, I'm inviting them to consider the possibility that that's a dead faith, whereas the living one is better understood in secular terms.
Yeah, and you used it toward the end.
Okay. So yeah, living versus dead faith, and which is kind of an interesting suggestion that a faith in anything eternal can easily be a dead faith, because it doesn't really need you to do anything. So it's easy enough to say that that's what you think, but then none of your behavior might reflect that. What do we think of that?
Say that again.
That it's easy for a faith that's a faith in the eternal to be a dead faith, because since that eternal doesn't actually need you to do anything, it's easy enough to say that you have this belief and then not do anything that would reflect that you have that belief.
Right. And
is that what Hagglund was saying just then? I have a little hard time understanding him. Was that the point that he was making?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it's the strong version of what he was saying. Yeah, he's trying not to antagonize believers along the way, but that would be sort of the strongest version of it. Is yes, this if your faith is in the eternal, it's probably dead because it doesn't need you. And so
hence you get this idea that well, could a person just live this completely immoral life and then on his deathbed he could ask for forgiveness and then he's fine? It's like, well, yeah, I guess apparently that does work within Christianity, because there's nothing you can do. You're continually saved. At least that was Christianity I grew up with.
Yeah. And I think his point is that the fact that this faith is in an eternal is what is enabling that. If it was not eternal, that would fall apart.
Yeah.
Which is it's an ironic way of looking at it. It's not the way you normally think about these things.
Yeah.
I have
the feeling that it has to do a lot with the imagination. How your imagination works.
Sure. Because you're having,
If you have no imagination, then where are you?
What Elena, can you say that again?
Well, if you have no imagination, so you think of yourself as being able to do something else than what you're doing, then you kind of stuck without imagination. You can't create anything.
I don't understand what that has to do with what we were saying.
What does it have to do with it? What were we saying? I'm sorry.
Dead faith. Live faith.
Yeah, that's faith. Okay, yeah, that's faith. Then you're stuck. I mean, I think, I think that's why we went into the abstract painting.
Freedom?
We were stuck.
Oh.
We're stuck with the reality of things.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm an abstract painter.
That's an interesting idea.
Mhm.
Kathy, it looked to me like you were going to say something. I was very excited.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, I didn't mean to, Helene. I just saw Kathy unmute herself.
Yeah.
I'm just curious how he would treat the teachings of Jesus, that nowhere have I heard him address what Jesus was teaching his followers.
No, he doesn't get into any of that. The way he talks about social change, though, I mean, I think he would embrace the what's called the social gospel, the more social or political reading of Jesus's teachings.
Yeah.
I
So
do find
he'll
it
embrace that.
difficult, though, to separate Jesus's teaching from Christianity, obviously named after the man.
Yeah, there are people in this country don't seem to have any trouble with that at all.
Exactly. They're all separate from it.
Well,
it's
But I understand your point.
and I concur. But I think as a philosopher, maybe it's an area that should be explored.
As a resource for inspiring people to change, yes, and I think if you asked him that question, he would likely say something like that. It's not something that I mean, my impression is that he just didn't grow up with any of these sorts of things, so it doesn't really resonate to him personally, and so there are places where you could imagine he might bring in some of this other kinds of teaching, other ideas about social change and where they came from, and he just doesn't go there. It's just not in his field of vision at the moment.
Right, because you could have all those teachings without Jesus being involved at all. I mean, all of these ideas are available without buying into anything about Jesus, the Christian Jesus.
Which I think is true. It's absolutely true. But if you're talking about Christianity, you're cutting a great amount of theology out of Christianity if you're not talking about Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, and this is part of the bit about him not that this book doesn't address the question of how do we get from here to there. So, which he has in some interviews talked about, that's what he's been working on lately. So that particular kind of project, I think, would be more interested in those ideas, because you can use those to talk about that. How do we get from here to there? Mm-hmm. But in terms of what he's doing with just the book and just the material this book covers, because he's not talking about the transition, those kinds of questions, he's just leaving that for some other time. It's
easier for him to simplify the paradigm.
Well, you can't write a book about everything all at once. Would I think might be the other way, so that becomes great material for the follow-up book. Yeah.
And he's just not talking about Christian faith, right? He's talking about any belief system that believes in the eternal.
Yeah,
the infinite.
Well, in the book, he spends most of his time talking about Christian conceptions of heaven and Buddhist conceptions of nirvana, and he's sort of using those two as the example. There's one from the East and one from the West.
Yeah.
But it's true. It's a little bit more. It would be a little more awkward for him to try and substitute Islam or Judaism for Christianity, because their social teachings are a little more robust. And Buddhism is easy for him to include, because Buddhism has a history of its social teachings being very weak. So it's already sort of there's already longstanding critique of Buddhism doing the kind of thing that he's pointing out is problematic by having this faith in this thing that's eternal rather than faith in what's finite and vulnerable. Wonderful. Okay. Yeah. Is there a particular topics you want me to go to? No, we have 2 more weeks, or I could just keep unfolding what I'm doing now. But if there's something else, something different you want me to focus on, I can go find that material.
We don't meet on Thanksgiving. We're done before Thanksgiving.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So yeah, just 2 more weeks.
I'll miss this.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I love teaching and I have good fun doing this.
It's just
nice to all come and learn. I'm going to take my general pattern's been to do 2 a year, so I'll take winter off and I'll get a class ready for spring.
Do you know what it'll be?
Not yet. That's the problem. I need to figure that out.
Well, it's very provocative. I love this.
Maybe he'll come out with a second book in between, or another book in between. We could just continue. All right. Well, we're past class time, so I should let you go.
Okay, bye.
Take care, everyone. Right.